3 weeks ago, a photographer I've worked alongside for over a decade mentioned casually over coffee at a mutual client's engagement shoot how much she was looking forward to my daughter's wedding next month, assuming reasonably that of course I already knew the date, the venue, all of it, since what mother wouldn't. I sat there holding my coffee, keeping my face perfectly professional, the way 20 years of coordinating other people's happiest days had trained me to do, while quietly understanding that my only daughter was getting married in 6 weeks, and I hadn't received so much as a text about it. What I didn't know yet, sitting in that cafe pretending everything was fine, was that the exclusion wasn't a slow drift born out of an ordinary falling out. It had been engineered carefully over 2 years by someone who'd had every reason to make sure I never found out how. If you've ever found out something devastating from someone who assumed you already knew, stay with me, because this story took me from that cafe table to a truth I genuinely never saw coming. My name is Teresa. I've worked as a wedding and event coordinator for over 20 years, which meant that learning about my own daughter's wedding secondhand from a colleague was a particular kind of professional irony I couldn't have invented if I'd tried. I have one daughter, Claire, 26 now, and for most of her life our relationship was close, warm, uncomplicated. I had no idea, sitting in that cafe, how much of the last 2 years had actually been quietly built against me. Claire's father, Richard, and I divorced when she was 11, after 9 years of a marriage that had grown increasingly difficult in ways I tried for a long time to shield her from. The divorce itself was civil enough on paper, a fair custody arrangement, reasonable co-parenting, the kind of separation people describe afterward as amicable, even when the truth underneath it is messier than that word suggests. I remarried 4 years later, a kind, steady man named Mark who took real care never to overstep with Claire, never pushing to be called anything other than Mark content, always to let the relationship build at whatever pace she needed. For a long time, that patience seemed to work. Claire attended our wedding, spent holidays across both households without apparent difficulty, the ordinary, complicated rhythm of a blended family that mostly held together. I've spent 2 decades in event coordination, which means I spend my professional life managing exactly the kind of complex, emotionally loaded family dynamics that show up at weddings, the seating charts built around old grudges, the careful choreography required when divorced parents share a dance floor for their child's biggest day. It's not glamorous work most of the time. It's precise, diplomatic, built on reading a room correctly before anyone says a word out loud. I never imagined I'd eventually need those same skills turned toward understanding my own family, gathering information, the same careful professional way I'd gather it for any client's complicated guest list. The shift, when I look back on it now, began small enough that I mostly missed it happening in real time. Claire started around 2 years ago, mentioning things her father had said about how things really went during the divorce, comments that struck me as oddly specific for a period she'd been far too young to remember clearly herself. Phrases that sounded less like a child's memory and more like someone else's carefully constructed narrative, repeated often enough to start sounding like fact. She'd mention them lightly in passing, the way you repeat something you've never once thought to question, and I'd let them pass just as lightly, unwilling each time to turn a casual family conversation into a defense of myself against a version of events I didn't yet realize was being built at all. One detail I noticed and filed away without much thought at the time. Richard had over those 2 years become unusually present at Claire's apartment, at her workplace events, at gatherings I wasn't invited to, but heard about secondhand, a level of involvement that felt different from the occasional comfortable co-parenting relationship we'd maintained for over a decade. Though I told myself repeatedly that a father growing closer to his adult daughter was simply a good thing, nothing that required my scrutiny. Mark noticed it too, mentioned it once, gently asking whether I thought anything had shifted between Richard and Claire lately. I told him I didn't think so. I wasn't lying. I genuinely hadn't let myself see it yet. The distance grew gradually enough that each individual moment felt explainable on its own, the way real erosion always does, one small deniable choice at a time. About 18 months ago, at a family dinner that included both Richard and me for Claire's birthday, Richard mentioned, seemingly offhand, that he still remembered how hard those years right after the divorce were when her mom was so checked out. Claire nodded along quiet, and I felt my stomach drop because I remembered those exact years with total clarity, remembered fighting for every additional custody day I could get, remembered nothing that resembled checked out in any sense of the phrase. I said nothing that night, unwilling to turn Claire's birthday into a confrontation, though the comment sat with me for weeks afterward, resurfacing at odd moments in the car in the middle of unrelated meetings the way an unanswered accusation tends to. A year ago at Claire's engagement party, I overheard Richard's now wife Deborah telling a cluster of Claire's friends in a tone dripping with practiced sympathy that Claire had really been raised by her dad, mostly that I'd been around but not really present a version of history, so completely inverted from what had actually happened, that I stood frozen for a moment, coffee cup halfway to my mouth, before deciding again not to make a scene at my daughter's engagement celebration. Claire nearby didn't correct it. I told myself she simply hadn't heard clearly. I've thought about that moment more than almost any other since, wondering what might have shifted if I'd simply corrected it myself right there, instead of protecting an evening that wasn't mine to protect at my own expense. 10 months ago, Claire canceled our standing monthly lunch for the third time in a row. Each cancellation, reasonable on its own. Work, busy wedding planning. Busy life, simply busy. The kind of pattern that's easy to explain away individually, and much harder to see clearly once you finally step back and count them together. When I asked gently if everything was okay between us, she said, "Of course, Mom." Why wouldn't it be in a tone that told me even then that something specific was being carefully managed beneath the surface of that reassurance? 8 months ago, my sister mentioned during an unrelated phone call that she'd run into Deborah at a mutual friend's baby shower, and that Deborah had asked with unusual specificity whether I'd ever really apologized to Claire for everything, a phrase vague enough to mean anything and pointed enough to mean something very particular. I asked my sister what she thought Deborah meant. My sister, uncomfortable, said only that she hadn't wanted to push the conversation further at a baby shower and quickly changed the subject. 6 months ago, at a work event, I ran into an old family friend who mentioned warmly how proud everyone must be watching Claire plan her wedding, and how sweet it was that Richard had taken such an active role helping her with the guest list, hosting planning dinners at his house nearly every other week. I smiled and said something non-committal, though I remember driving home that evening, turning the phrase active role over and over, wondering for the first time, with any real suspicion, what exactly that role had come to include. 3 months ago, at what I now understand was Claire's bridal shower, an event I wasn't invited to and only learned about afterward through a photo a distant cousin posted online, tagged with a caption thanking everyone who supported Claire. Through everything, a phrase that at the time I read as simply generic celebratory language, the kind every bridal shower caption uses without particular weight behind it. That same week, I asked Claire directly over a rare returned phone call whether everything was fine with the wedding planning, whether there was anything I could help with the way I'd helped coordinate dozens of other families' weddings professionally for years. She said everything was handled, her voice carrying a politeness that felt, for the first time in our relationship, genuinely unfamiliar, distant in a way I couldn't place. "You don't need to worry about any of it, Mom," she said. Then quieter, almost like a door closing gently rather than slamming, she added that she'd got a lot of support already. It was the first time in 26 years she'd ever drawn that particular line, and I remember standing in my kitchen afterward feeling the floor tilt slightly even though I couldn't yet say why. 3 weeks ago at that cafe table, the photographer mentioned the date. If you found out your own child's wedding date from someone else entirely, someone who simply assumed you already knew, would you have called immediately demanding answers, or would you have done what I did, spending the following days quietly trying to understand how something this large had been kept from you for so long before saying a single word? Tell me honestly in the comments, because what I found once I actually looked was so much worse than simple distance. I didn't call Claire immediately. 20 years of managing complicated family dynamics professionally had taught me exactly one lesson above all others. You never walk into a difficult conversation without understanding its full shape first, because half-understood hurt gets talked around by anyone skilled enough to manage a narrative. And based on the last 2 years, someone had clearly been managing this one very carefully. So I did the one thing I actually knew how to do. I called a few trusted contacts in the wedding industry, the same professional network I'd built over 2 decades, and asked carefully what I could learn about Claire's wedding without involving her directly yet. A venue coordinator I'd worked with for years confirmed gently that the invitations had gone out 4 months earlier, meaning this wasn't a last-minute oversight or a stressed bride simply forgetting a task. It had been a deliberate guest list decision made months in advance, maintained carefully enough that not one of Claire's friends or family members had ever mentioned it to me directly. A florist I'd known even longer added almost apologetically that she'd assumed I was simply choosing to skip the planning dinners out of some unspoken tension, since Richard had been present at nearly all of them. Before I said anything to Claire, Deborah called me unprompted for the first time in nearly 2 years, inviting me to catch up over coffee. Just us, a suggestion so out of character that I agreed mostly out of curiosity about what she actually wanted. She spent most of that coffee asking more directly than her tone suggested was casual, whether I'd been talking to anyone about the wedding lately, and whether I still had copies of the old custody paperwork from the divorce. I answered honestly, watching her relax in a way that told me exactly who had sent her to find that out. That same week, I did something I hadn't done in over a decade. I pulled my own copies of our divorce records from storage, the custody agreements, the mediator's notes, the actual dated paperwork from the year everything fell apart. Records I'd kept out of the same professional habit that made me keep records of everything without ever imagining I'd need them for anything other than old paperwork. 2 days later, I drove to Richard and Deborah's house, unannounced records in hand, and found Richard in his study going through what looked like wedding-related paperwork of his own. He looked up, and something in my expression must have told him immediately why I'd come. I told him plainly that he'd been telling Claire I was checked out during the divorce, that I wasn't really present, that she was raised mostly by him. For one full breath, something in Richard's face genuinely broke, not performance, not deflection. Just a man watching 2 years of careful narrative-building collapse in real time. He said it started small, that after the divorce, he was so afraid of losing time with her, and every time he felt insecure about that, it got a little easier to remember things the way that made him feel like the more important parent. He said he'd told himself he wasn't really lying, just emphasizing things differently. For that one breath, I almost recognized the man I'd once built a life with. Then just as fast the mask came back up. He said this didn't have to become some huge confrontation, that Claire was happy that the wedding was in 6 weeks, and did it really matter now how she got there? I told him it mattered because she got there believing a story that wasn't true, laying the mediator's notes on his desk beside whatever paperwork he'd been reviewing. His version, the actual record. I opened the file to the page documenting custody days, the year-by-year log showing exactly who had fought for additional time, exactly who had missed scheduled visitations, exactly whose signature appeared on the request for extended holiday custody 3 separate years running. It wasn't my signature on the missed visitation notices. He tried once more, asking if I was really going to drag up documents from 15 years ago right before her wedding. I told him he was the one who'd been quietly using the last 2 years to rewrite what actually happened 15 years ago, and that I was just finally looking at what I should have looked at the moment Claire started repeating things that didn't match my own memory of raising her. Richard didn't have an immediate answer for that. Then, almost reflexively, he reached for something closer to justification than apology, saying he'd never told her anything false on purpose, that memory is complicated, that people remember things differently. I told him memory doesn't file inverted custody paperwork. He did that, on purpose, repeatedly. For years, to a child who had no way of knowing to question it. I drove to Claire's apartment that same evening, records in hand, uncertain for the first time in weeks what I actually planned to say once I got there. Claire opened the door, already looking uneasy, as though some part of her had been expecting this conversation longer than she'd admit. I didn't lead with anger. I set the mediator's file on her kitchen counter, the same way I'd once have laid out a vendor contract for a nervous bride, and told her only that I thought she'd been told a version of our divorce that wasn't true, and that she deserved to actually see the paperwork before deciding what she believed about me. She read through it slowly, several minutes of silence in that kitchen, her expression shifting from confusion into something heavier as she reached the pages documenting who had actually missed scheduled visits during the years she'd been told I was checked out. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet. She said her dad had told her I basically disappeared for a while, that she mostly remembered him because he was the one who was actually there. I told her I fought for every extra day I could get, that I had the paperwork requesting it, that I never once missed a scheduled visit in 11 years. I told her I didn't know what her father was going through that made repeating this story easier for him than telling her the truth. But I did know it wasn't true. And I knew she deserved better than 2 years of quietly being steered away from me because of it. Claire called off the wedding for 1 week while she sat with everything she'd learned a delay that terrified her fiancé's family until she explained enough of the situation for them to understand. She and I have spent the weeks since in more honest conversation than we'd had in the previous 2 years, combined careful, sometimes painful conversations about exactly how thoroughly she'd absorbed a version of her own childhood that had never actually happened the way she'd been told. Deborah called me 2 weeks after that evening in Richard's study, not to defend him, but almost ashamed of her own part in it. She admitted she'd believed him too. Mostly that some part of her had wanted to believe the version where he was simply the better parent, and that she was sorry she'd helped him keep it going as long as he did. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't close to enough. But it was the first fully honest thing she'd said to me in years. The final piece came a month later from Richard's own sister, my former sister-in-law, who called to tell me something Richard had apparently confided to her years earlier, back when the divorce was still fresh. That his fear of Claire eventually choosing me over him had started long before any of this rooted in his own father's absence. Growing up, a fear he'd apparently decided at some point was easier to manage by quietly rewriting the past than by actually trusting Claire to love him without needing the story adjusted in his favor. I was invited back to the wedding, rescheduled now for 2 months out instead of 6 weeks. And Claire has asked me to help coordinate parts of it, an offer that carries a complicated kind of relief given how the last 2 years unfolded. Richard will still be there. Claire has asked both of us directly to simply behave, and we've agreed for her sake, though I won't pretend the two of us have found anything resembling real resolution yet. Mark has been quieter than usual through all of it, careful not to make Claire's process about him, though I've noticed him standing a little closer than usual whenever Richard's name comes up now. I won't tell you this ended clean. Claire and I are closer now than we've been in 2 years, but there's a version of her early 20s. I simply lost conversations and milestones I wasn't part of because of a story that was never true. Time I don't think either of us knows quite how to get back. I've made peace with the parts that never got resolved because I've stopped believing every ending needs to. There's a particular kind of grief in that I didn't expect one that has nothing to do with anger and everything to do with time. I keep doing the math without meaning to, counting up the birthdays, the ordinary Tuesday phone calls, the small, unremarkable moments that make up an actual relationship. All of it quietly rerouted around me for 2 years, while I had no idea there was anything to fight for. Claire has started sending me small things lately, almost as if to make up the difference, a photo from a dress fitting a question about a vendor, the kind of ordinary inclusion that used to happen without either of us noticing it was happening at all. I try not to read too much into any single one of them. I've learned this year especially that patterns matter more than individual moments, and the pattern lately has been her reaching first. Mark asked me recently whether I thought Richard would ever fully admit out loud to Claire exactly how deliberate the last 2 years had actually been, rather than the softened version he's settled into calling a misunderstanding. I told him I honestly didn't know and that I'd stopped needing his full confession to feel like the ending was mine to write instead of his. If you've ever found out someone rewrote your own history behind your back, tell me in the comments what finally showed you the truth, whatever form the proof happened to take. If this one hit home, share it with someone who's ever had to fight to be remembered accurately by their own family, and subscribe, because there's another story like this one waiting for you next week.